Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next event in our 2022 Animal Law Week. We've got a great lineup of speakers, and we are very grateful to have David Wolfson with us. He is one of our funding fathers who helped raise the initial capital to get our program started in the first place back in 2014 due to a generous gift from Brad Goldberg. And he has also been very involved in advising other donors giving to academic programs, including those at Yale, and also Bob Barker, when he gave about $1 million a piece to about 7 different law schools back in the early 2000s. David's a longtime friend and colleague, and he has got had a really unique position in that he's done a bunch of amazing scholarship related to animal law, particularly related to farmed animals, and has been able to have a massive impact on the field, all while holding down a day job, and is now the executive director of Milbank, a major Wall Street firm. So curious to hear more about his path and how he's been able to make that work. So please join me in welcoming David Wolfson.
Thank you very much. So it is such a pleasure to be in a room with people, particularly as everyone is at least 6 feet away from me. Good. But I'm actually, this has been great timing because the law firm that I'm at, Milbank, has a program that it does with the Harvard Law School executive education team. And we bring our associates up in their 4th year, and then in their 5th year, and then in their 6th year to spend a week over at Harvard's executive education program learning about business and finance and other things. And so we are the first program officially back at Harvard in the executive education program. So there's like 45 Milbank lawyers across the road. And we've been welcoming professors into the classroom for the first time for 2 years. And it's just a wonderful thing. So it's terrific to be here. Chris asked me, he sent me an email, and I have it here, basically, to sort of give an outline of my journey, which hopefully will give some value to you all, in terms of my interaction with animal protection and other issues around animals. Since I guess I started in my legal career, and my path has been meandering. I would say it was certainly unplanned and without thought. So, and full of constant surprises and twists that I didn't expect. So I'm definitely not the right person if you're looking for someone who made a decision at 27 to make a plan and then follow it in terms of their career, because that's not me. What I do think, hopefully, is I'll show you how things can just happen in your career, especially if you do certain things along the way, very basic things, I think, which is just basically build connections, find people who are interested in the same things and who are driven by the same passions, and who essentially want to do something to make the world a better place. I think if you have those principles, then things just tend to happen. Then we got like 35, 40 minutes. I'm going to go reasonably quick. I'll be talking about myself, which can be a little bit boring, but the goal is to give you a sense of my background, and then I would love questions. It's much more interesting if you guys ask questions, and you can interrupt me at any point to ask me anything. So my accent's a little strange. I'm from England originally. I've been in America for 30 years. As I say, I have just enough of my English accent left that my wife still finds it interesting, but not much more than that. I did my undergraduate education in the States, went back to start my law school training in England, and then decided I wanted to come over and do a JD in America. And I went to New York and I did a JD there. And I thought that I wanted to do public interest work when I was in law school. And I thought I wanted to do originally human rights public interest work, or death penalty work, or environmental issues. And I had this interest in animals as well. And I'd always had it in my life. When I was an undergraduate, I was involved in a student activist group on campus, and we did a bunch of things. But I was also involved, and this was a long time ago, this was the 80s. I was also involved in anything that was anti-Ronald Reagan, anything that was anti-apartheid, anything that was anti-Contra in South America, West Central America. And so I was in that space, and I kept thinking that I would do something else, and it wouldn't necessarily be animal stuff, but I kept finding myself particularly interested in the animal issues. Something about it just got to me in a way, and it seemed for some reason that it didn't get to everybody else. And so I kept finding myself focusing on it. And when I went to do interviews at other environments, human rights work, etc., and you guys know this, I mean, people find their own. People who want to do human rights work or death penalty work or environmental work, they really want to do it. It's like they're drawn to it. And I would interview these people, and it's clear that I cared, but it wasn't really my passion. And so I would just constantly not get hired in these places. I kept focusing on animal issues. When I was in law school, I did a paper on how the law covers farmed animals with a professor at that time at Columbia, who I think is now at Emory, Martha Feynman, who has gone on to make a name for herself in a number of different areas. She was very sympathetic. And so I wrote this independent study about how the law fails to cover the way farmed animals are treated, and more specifically how state laws have been specifically amended over time to exempt common or normal farming practices from the reach of the anti-cruelty statutes, and how federal law doesn't work in that area. And I just wrote it as part of the class. Running out of ideas of what to do, I did what lots of people do, which is I joined the interviewing for summer associates positions at large law firms. And I picked Milbank because I liked the people and because they had a really good pro bono program. And I didn't care about anything else. I hadn't thought about it, and I expected that I would spend exactly 1 year at Milbank, which shows you how you shouldn't rely on anything I say. And I started as a litigator. At the same time, because I was just passionate about the animal rights issues, I started to run into people. One of the individuals I met was a guy who was very well known at the time called Henry Spira. And Henry was the first really successful animal protection advocate. He, if you know of it, is the guy who started to focus on cosmetic testing, and the guy who sort of created the image of a rabbit eye being blinded for the sake of cruelty, who started these alternative testing programs with Avon and Revlon and all of these companies. And he was just starting to turn into animal rights, farmed animal stuff. And so he read the paper I wrote, an independent study, and he said, would you let me put it out as my own little publication? I was like, sure. So this is the old days. He printed up on the press and he would hand it out to people. And that's where it started. And I went off to Milbank, where I joined as a litigator. And my first thought was, well, I'm going to do animal protection pro bono work, because again, I just couldn't get it out of my system. And so I was friendly with this couple called Jean and Laurie Bauer. I just met them basically on the street. And they had an organization called Farm Sanctuary. And so my first client in like 1993 was Farm Sanctuary. And the first case I did for them was upstate New York. For those of you who know Farm Sanctuary, they have a big farm sanctuary in upstate New York. And the local town had decided that it was a beautiful piece of property and they wanted to tax it. But because it was a 501c3, not for profit, they were not meant to pay real estate tax. But the local community said that makes no sense. It's a gorgeous farm and we want the money. And they're caring for farmed animals. It's not a dog and cat shelter. They're farmed animals, and that can't work. And so they took it to the initial level court, and the court ruled that caring for animals could not be a not-for-profit activity that would exempt you from paying taxes, and that they had to pay taxes. And so they came to Milbank, and we did a case that went up to the appellate level, and we were able to have that overturned. That was my first real involvement. And at that point, I was a litigator for a year and a half, pretty much realized quickly, and we can chat about this if anyone's interested, that I was not made to be a litigator, unlike some of us who are made to be litigators. It's just natural. It wasn't my thing. And so I was sort of wondering whether I should do that or something else. And so I switched over to corporate law because I figured, why not? I didn't know what corporate law was. I remembered I went to the guy in the M&A group at Milbank, and I was lucky enough that someone knew him and liked me. And he's like, so you want to do M&A? And I said, absolutely. He said, so you know what we do, right? I'm like, absolutely. I said, okay, you're in. I'm like, great. What do you do? I have no idea. So I made that switch, but all along I had this sort of itch, which was, if I cared about animal protection or a social justice issue, I felt that it was wrong if I didn't devote myself 100% to it, even though there were things about doing that gave me a great deal of concern personally. At that moment in particular, also, this was the mid-90s, and the animal protection movement was not like it is today. The opportunities were very, very different. The programs were not as developed. And so I interviewed at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and I was hired, and I left Milbank, and I went down to Washington, D.C., to work with them on litigation strategies and other things in the Maryland office. And I realized very quickly, and there was nothing wrong with the Animal Legal Defense Fund, that it was not for me. And so one of the things I'd say is like, what was my first point of my little personal journey is you have to work out what it is you want. And sometimes what you want may not be what you think you should want, or even what you think you should be doing. You may think you should be doing something, but it may not actually make you feel incredibly happy in the morning to get up and do stuff. And at that moment, and I think it would be very different today, because ALTF and all the organizations are doing so much at so many levels and are so professionalized. But at that moment, it didn't fit me to be in a small office of a small not-for-profit when I really was someone who thrived in New York City. I liked the intensity and craziness of just doing things. I'm one of these people, like sometimes I don't even have to know what it is I'm doing as long as I'm doing something that's like crazy and tiring, and at the end of it, I feel like I can sleep for 2 days. So it just did not work out for me. And so I went back to Milbank. And that was a period of time where I wasn't thinking about partnership with Milbank, but I was thinking a lot about farmed animal issues and policy in the US. And I had come to the conclusion, along with a few other people, that we needed to change the way that laws treated farmed animals. And in particular, what the animal protection movement had done under the leadership of someone who's not really involved so much in the movement, but at the time was a real leader of the movement called Wayne Pacelle. I don't know how many of you know Wayne Pacelle. He had a bit of a Me Too moment. He was not involved in the movement anymore, but at that time he was leading the policy side. And the animal protection movement had learned how to use ballot initiatives to pass laws that legislatures did not want. And as you can imagine, passing farmed animal laws to prohibit common methods of farming, were not popular things to get through state legislatures, especially state legislatures that had large farm animal populations. Then you could forget it. And it was also not possible to pass those laws at the federal level because, well, now it's not possible to pass anything at the federal level, but then you could at least pass a few things, but not farm animal stuff. So a group of us said, you know what, we need to change that. And so we worked for a period of time, and Kathy was involved, there's a whole bunch of people involved in it, to pass laws in different states to start phasing out what are known as common methods of farming that are particularly egregious. So whether it be the gestation crate for pigs or the field crate for calves or the battery cage. And we initiated a whole host of ballot initiatives starting in Florida and Arizona and then California, which led to state laws, which led to more ballot initiatives, which led to laws that prohibit the sale of products into states if they don't meet the state requirements, and so on. Very popular ballot initiatives that have got a lot of popular support. Now, that started in around 99, 2000, and it had a successful run, I'd say, until 2 years ago, with even 2 years ago, was it maybe 4 years ago now, actually, in California, Massachusetts, and elsewhere. And I think that movement was a very big part of the momentum around educating the public around how animals are raised for food, which led into a lot of other stuff like labeling, whether you like it or not, or corporate campaigns to say that you won't serve certain types of, raise animals a certain way. Or I don't know who Harvard uses, but they probably use Sodexo or Compass for their food services, and they have sustainable food policies and all of that stuff. And then obviously the rise of vegan alternatives, Beyond Meat, Impossible, whatever. I think all of these ballot initiatives really helped kickstart that whole thing around farm animals. And so I was delighted to be involved in it. You're probably aware that about 4 hours ago, I think, the Supreme Court said that it would hear an appeal, assert on a California ballot that was passed recently, which would prohibit the sale of products into California that did not meet California state humane standards. And so it's quite possible that all of that work is in jeopardy as we speak. And we'll just have to wait to see what happens. Although I feel very confident that even if the worst thing happened, the work was very valuable and caused great change. But you never know. So I did that while staying at Milbank, representing groups like the Humane Society of the United States, Mercy for Animals. We did some litigation with Farm Sanctuary and HSUS with Kathy, challenging an attempted common farming standard in New Jersey that went all the way up to the New Jersey Supreme Court. And a whole bunch of stuff around farm animals. And that took me into like the late 90s, and I also started to teach. I was lucky enough actually to teach here at Harvard in 1993, I think. And I started to teach law school, animal law classes at Columbia and at NYU and a few other places. But at the same time, I was balancing my job at Milbank as a corporate lawyer. So I guess I am proof that you can go into a large law firm and do pro bono work and have it be of value. I am certainly of proof that there is real value in having large law firms do pro bono work, especially less so perhaps now, but then when you're in a space that is not necessarily accepted in the judicial world or just generally as maybe being appropriate. So the fact that Milbank would be involved in a lawsuit would immediately get people's attention in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have otherwise. We represent people for the ethical treatment of animals over FOIA litigation. We've done work for Animal Outlook, which is the prevention of a killing. We represent Humane League. We represent Animal Equality. We represent the Good Food Institute. Basically, every animal protection group that you can think of, we represent or have represented at some point. And there is great value in that. It's something that my firm supports. The good news is that all law firms now get rated on pro bono programs, so even if they don't need it, they have to do it. And for those of you, whatever your public interest is, you know, you can do it. It's for everyone to work out whether they are the right fit for a large law firm or not. I have certain qualities that work. I think I'm honestly not as uncomfortable with the gray than some people might have when they work in institutions like that. And that may be by both a weakness and a strength for me. And I can totally understand why some people might find it just not a comfortable fit. But at the same time, there are advantages. You obviously get trained extremely well. You can pay off your your debt in apparently 6 months nowadays. And Milbank's largely responsible for that. And you just have the benefits of a platform, a really good platform as, you know, to do something. I also started to work with Bob Barker at that point. And Bob was a wonderful man. That Chris originally was the guy who really got Bob involved. And he gave money to law schools saying that you have to teach an animal law class. And it was interesting at the time, a lot of people questioned whether that was a valuable thing. It was easy. Whenever you do anything strategically, it's always very easy to undercut it. And it's very hard to know what will actually come out of it. But there was a view of like a class every 2 years. Is that really worth it? You give $1 million and all you get is a class every 2 years. And I think that's an appropriate criticism. But the fact is that because Bob did those classes at Columbia, at Virginia, at other law schools, including Harvard particularly, it changed the way the academy and other people think about animal law, and is directly linked to the incredible success that we've had here at Harvard in terms of its program. So, you know, these things, you have to work them out. I became a partner in 2003 in mergers and acquisitions, solely because I failed to have the imagination to think of anything else I could do with my life. And that's okay. You know, sometimes that's okay. I mean, there were obviously remunerations and advantages and whatever. But for me, it worked really well because maybe this is too much disclosure, but I'm not necessarily I can have a hard time working for an organization that I have to follow everything the organization says it does. And that can be difficult in any public interest movement. And for me, what I liked was the freedom of being a counselor to all of these people who needed it, but not having to be tied down by the politics and the various sort of infighting and other things that had to go on. I made a point of not going on the boards of any animal protection organizations so that I could just retain my independence when I advised them. And then over time, my work became a little different. I started doing, you know, much more policy work. And then, honestly, the policy work got taken over by people who were just far better at doing policy work than I would be. Because, you know, in 1998, there was no one doing it. But in 2006, there were a lot of people, smart people, people like yourselves, who went into these organizations doing it. So I tend to try to look for things that other people aren't doing. One thing I found that I've done a lot of is I've done a lot of crisis advice, strange as it may sound. A lot of not-for-profits had moments of crisis. And there's turmoil at the board, there's turmoil in leadership, there's a mistake that's been made, a potential lawsuit that has happened, whatever. And they often need someone just to come in and help them through that. And I also started to get involved at that point with building academic programs, solely because I was lucky enough. I was on the board of one organization called the Animal Welfare Trust, which was set up by a wonderful man called Brad Goldberg. And all he did was give money to other animal protection groups and things that he cared about. And he was smart enough to realize, and this is again a bias, but the value of education in this space. There are, I don't know how familiar you guys are with effective altruism and how that goes into giving and all of that stuff. And I think it's fair to say that there's been a bit of tension between some of us in the giving community and EA because they look for very measurable things. And how do you measure, an animal law policy program? How do you measure an animal law class? I, however, believe strongly in education. And what we did initially is we started up a program at NYU where we decided that the community we most cared about was undergraduates. You guys are all great, assuming you're all law students, but the problem when I meet you, and I meet you usually as a second-year law student, is you've already decided what you're doing. You're going to a law firm or you're going somewhere else, and we can be of great value and lead you, but if you know what you're doing, you're in the animal law path. But unfortunately in law school, if you make that decision in the third year, that can be really hard. Whereas when you get to the undergraduates and you speak to a senior or a junior as an undergraduate, there's a lot of value to give. So we created an animal studies minor at NYU through the generous gift of Brad. And we started teaching programs like animals and ethics, animals in the environment, animals in public policy, animals in political theory, and also animals in the arts, drama, everything, anything and everything you could think of. I teach a class and have taught a class for almost 10 years now on animals and public policy to undergraduates. I don't teach in the law school anymore, and I just absolutely love that class, and I love undergraduates. They're not as cautious as law school students. They say things before thinking them out. They're less worried about sounding stupid in front of other people. And sometimes they say really stupid things, but often they say things that everyone else is thinking, even if they may not be correct. So they're really valuable. So we did that, then we created a master's in animal studies, and then we decided that what we needed was a think tank, which was essentially a place where environmental issues and animal issues connect. And I'd say that's really been sort of the last 8 to 10 years of my career, because the relationship between environmental issues and animal issues was much closer. And this is what I've been told, and I defer to others, but much closer, say, in the 60s and 70s. And then there was a bit of a separation. There were fights around individual rights for animals as opposed to species populations. There was, in my mind, and since I'm not teaching you, I can be less objective than I normally am. I believe there was a very romantic mythology within the environmental movement that would do anything to preserve the sacred interaction between humans and animals, to eat them. While they may not like factory farms, they still think there's something essential about the way we inhabit the world, that we have to kill animals and then we thank people for, thank the spirits or whatever. But it's like there was a lot of tension there, and I constantly go to these factory farming panels where everyone would talk about environmental issues around factory farming, but never mention the ethical issues. In the last 10 or 15 years, probably because everything's got so bad, that has changed. And so the relationship between environmental harm on humans and the causes of it from animals, the relationship between wildlife and environmental issues, climate change and the relationships with wildlife, climate change and its interaction with animal farming, health and its interaction with animal farming, disease and its interaction with animal farming. All of these things are getting closer and closer together. That means that it's possible that solutions align too, although I wouldn't stake a lot of money that will always stay the same way. And so we set up a center called the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection to produce data and policy around that crossover, particularly in the areas of factory farming and climate and the area of wildlife. So I did that, and then one day in my office about 7 years ago, I got a call from my boss, who's the chairman of Milbank, who suggested that I would be better not doing what I was doing, but doing something else. It wasn't really a suggestion, but basically I was told that while he loved me as a mergers and acquisitions partner, he would vastly prefer me to do something else. And I asked him what that was, and he said, well, I'd like you to manage the firm, run the firm. I'm like, what does that mean? He says, I have no idea. There are just these people looking at me, I don't know what to do. And what had happened is our previous chairman had left. He had taken the role. Our previous chairman did not practice, just managed, and our current chairman practices and manages. So I was asked to take on this role of essentially managing the day-to-day operations of the organization on a business side. But because I'm a lawyer and a partner, that allows me to do recruiting and professional development and pro bono, etc. Again, I did not envision or plan this in any way. So it just sort of happened. But what also started to happen, which is I think the other point I'll state, is because of the opportunities that I had through my law firm to, for example, build the Harvard program and get to know all the Harvard Law School people and all the business school people. And then I find the people who are interested in climate change and animal agriculture. Or I do it within my own firm and I find the lawyers who are interested, or I do it within my not-for-profits. Or I find people who are giving in the philanthropic space and the farm animal space and I find interest. I sort of been able to create a bit of a role of, I guess, a broker or a connector of different people. And that's been very valuable. So I was here one day and I decided I'd go see Martha Minham, who was wonderful. And I went to talk to her in her office because we were running the program and we started talking. And then she said to me, you know, what do you do? And so I started talking about the animal protection work I've done and the balance initiatives and all this other stuff. And then she's like, wow, it would be so good to do something here at Harvard like that. And I was like, okay. And so I went and I spoke to Brad Goldberg again. And Brad met with Martha in our offices in Milbank, and we struck a deal, the easiest deal that we've ever struck because Martha's amazing. And we were able to put together the initial version of the animal law and policy practice here with obviously Professor Stilt, and put together an executive director position, and then get Chris, at which point I'd done nothing, and everything that's happened since is because of Chris and Giston and others, and obviously now Kathy and all these wonderful people here. And it absolutely just came out of the fact that I decided to go and chat with Martha Minnow one day. And I was able to say what I cared about. And it turned out that she cared about things like that too. And she's been brilliant. I mean, I've introduced you in other areas and other things. And so that is one of the things that I, get if it was a sort of moral lesson of my life path, is to the extent that you care about things and you're willing to expose your caring to other people and be authentic about them, they'll do the same. And then before you know it, you can create and build things. So that happened here. There's been some giving in Yale Law School as well that I was slightly involved in. And then the final thing, I guess I'd say, and we can chat a little bit, is I became more interested about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, around the climate and animal agriculture crossover. I care deeply about animal rights and animal ethics, but I'm a little more focused on the fate of the planet at this point in terms of it disappearing. Well, at least it's for us to disappear from it, I guess. And so I started to get involved in climate. I'm now on the board of an organization called CDP. What CDP does is it forces companies to disclose data around carbon emissions, methane emissions, water usage, etc. It works with asset managers like Vanguard or Wellington or Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, Neuberger Berman, and basically the asset managers say, we will invest in your stock, but you have to disclose. And when you disclose, we have to use CDP, and CDP gives you a big data form, and then they fill it out, and then we disclose it, and then we do grading, and we do education, and the whole point is transparency to transformation around oil and gas to renewables, around other things to other things. And as you're probably aware, the SEC just mandated climate disclosure, and if you read that, they talk about CDP, the organization I'm on, all the way through it, because CDP is the organization that does the most of it. It basically covers like 30% of all the companies in the world. And so one of the things I've been working with them on is raising money to focus on disclosure around food. Because as you all know, food is a huge climate problem, but the problem is generally because it's under scope 3, but there's a lot of missed disclosure around food. It can be food in the way it's produced, it can be food in the way it's purchased. Google gives free food to everybody. How much of that is meat? How much of that has, implications on the planet? All these type of things. I think we're unfortunately in a moment where, and I'm not happy about it, but where the likelihood of causing significant change around any of the issues that we all care about occurring in our government is incredibly low. And we're seeing it every day. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. In the absence of political, of pressure from the public on our government, that will not change in my mind. I personally believe that needs to happen. I'm actually involved with a group called the Climate Emergency Fund that is investing in activism around climate, because you didn't, civil rights movement or women's rights movement or Black Lives Matter or whatever, you have to have some form of activism. And for some reason, climate change has gone a little too professional, a little too quick. And it's sort of missing that edge, which is putting pressure on politicians and the government to act. In the absence of that, we can't rely on that. And so most of our change, which is probably not going to be enough, unfortunately, will come through things like corporate disclosure, transformation of purchasing decisions, alternative products, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all very much like, well, capitalism is going to save us, and I'm not so certain I buy that. But given the limitations in DC at this moment, it's hard to envision another path, you know. So that is what I've been doing, and I'm basically now more involved in the climate, animal, agriculture space, still doing my executive director role, and still representing a number of animal protection groups in a number of ways. And I think we don't have much time left, so I will take a pause at that moment, and then hopefully people have questions. Yes.
Yeah, please raise your hand if you have a question and wait for the mic so that people on Zoom can hear.
Hi, thank you for being with us. I was just wondering, you talked a lot about how you focus on pro bono work and a particular issue area throughout your career that sort of, I mean, not as focused on environmental work, but sort of adjacent to that. And one thing I was wondering about is if you ever encountered conflicts and how you manage that, because sometimes pro bono work tends to focus on issues where there's unlikely to be conflicts, and I think that both environmental work and animal rights work would not fall into that category. So I was wondering how you navigate
No, it's
that.
an excellent question. The answer is yes. When I started my work around farm issues, I was always sort of second seat. So like a perfect example would be like the lawsuit, or third seat, the lawsuit we did in New Jersey. Milbank was not on the papers. I was representing an organization and I was part of the team, but our name didn't appear, so there was protection from that in case some of our clients might get upset. And at one point we actually represented Tyson. And so they might have got upset. I've certainly felt it a little bit in the climate space when I'm trying to do environmental work. Milbank's your classic problem because we are a leading energy firm, which means we are the leading lawyers on renewables, on solar, on all the good stuff, but we got there because we're the leading experts on the bad stuff. We're in a transition, just like the economy is in a transition. What I have found is I used to be the curious sort of animal rights guy, and now I'm actually, oh, maybe I'm just deluding myself, but I'm not radical anymore. Like the work that I do and the stuff that's happened in our society, whether it be the vegan food options or the choices or the connections with climate, etc. I'm not radical anymore, to the point that I used to desperately always call myself an animal protection lawyer because I was frightened that I'd get this moniker of animal rights lawyer. And then one day I got a phone call from my chairman who was close to Tyson and who wanted me to speak to them because he had told them that they had got one of the leading animal rights lawyers in the world and that he would be ready to talk to them at any time to give them advice on certain situations. When the Huntington Life Sciences campaign was happening, which was this very direct action on this terrible company that was doing research on animals, and they were doing really aggressive tactics on Wall Street, I got phone calls from my clients to help me work out how to deal with them, with the Huntington Life Science things. So the thing I would say is the world is always moving, and what is considered difficult gets easier in some ways. But I'm not going to pretend that if you went to Milbank and you wanted to represent the water keepers bringing a lawsuit against a particular project that we helped finance, that we'd be able to do that. So you sort of have to navigate it. But there are ways to navigate it and to play a role and be involved. You just have to be careful and thoughtful about it and make sure you disclose and have the support of the organization.
Thank you so much for being with us today. You spoke a lot about how you were a litigator. And I'm kind of curious, especially because you ended up going into corporate work. One, is there transactional work right now in animal law? And two, is there any sort of like niche legal market for whether it's litigation or transactional work in animal law?
Yeah, great questions also. As a litigator, there's obviously always going to be a value for you in the animal protection space. There are not-for-profits that litigate. There is always going to be litigation. That said, and I'm interested if you disagree with this, a lot of the litigation is very much either defensive, that is something was passed and you're trying to protect it, or it's hard to transform much greatly through litigation at this point. And I'm sure there are exceptions to that, because she didn't nod, so I'm sure I'm getting it quite right. But I'm not certain, and one of the reasons it moved me away from it a little bit was how transformational it will be over the long haul. What I will say is any area of expertise you have in a legal space will be of value to animal protection not-for-profits. You could be a tax expert, and that will be of value. You can be an employment law expert, and that will definitely be of value. You can be an IP expert, and that will be of value. And even a transactional expert can be of value. But obviously what's interesting about the space is it has moved very much into the business sphere. So if you look at like venture capital involvement, I mean, half of our initial generation of animal rights activists are venture capitalists now, and doing startups and investing in all this stuff. And they use lawyers and need deals, experience. So and this sort of goes back to to the extent that you are neutral about what you want to do, there's probably a path that is a little closer aligned to animal protection work, like litigation. But I think the key for me is finding out what gives you joy and what practice that you might actually really like. And I'm pretty certain that whatever you like will be of value at some point. And even if it isn't initially of value, you will become of great value because of your expertise in what you've done. So I don't think it has to be limited, though I think litigation is clearly one part, but unfortunately, again, if you added up the number of, and you know this better than I do now, Chris, but I'm going to make a number, like if you added the number of open positions of a fellowship or an internship for a litigation position in an animal not-for-profit at this particular moment on an annual basis, it's probably 10.
At least, there always was this mantra that everyone wants to do animal and there's no jobs for them, but I know so many people right now that are having trouble filling.
Okay, so now it's good, but even it's 12 or 15, but my point is the opposite. It's not like 30. Yeah, so there's a limited number at the point.
Thank you. I guess my question is kind of related to the previous one, but in a somewhat different direction. I feel like you obviously were, at least with the exception of your first few months in practice, a corporate lawyer doing primarily, or at least largely, litigation pro bono, which I don't necessarily see as being that common, at least in the initial years at firms. I was wondering if that kind of is, I guess, more of a common practice than I kind of imagined. I think there's like a perception that a lot of pro bono work at firms is either for litigators, who obviously make up the minority of lawyers in most large corporate firms today, or is kind of incidental. There are obviously transactional and regulatory pro bono work, but it's kind of less interesting or kind of less people think of.
I mean, it's a very good point. I mean, I should clarify, I did do some litigation initially as a litigator, and then I had enough of a litigation background to play with it for a while, but I never would have let it. Like, I would never even dreamed of it. What happened pretty quickly for me after 3 or 4 years was I actually did all what you might call non-litigation work on a pro bono basis. And that could be, there are numerous things, like it could be, dealing with contractual issues around an organization that was trying to set up a labeling system. It could be working with I did some pro bono work for the city shelters and the cat and dog overpopulation issues in New York. So it was striking contracts between the Bloomberg administration and not-for-profits. It could be policy related, drafting legislation. It could be ballot initiatives. It could be whatever. So and then it became advising boards and just problems. Like I just get the phone calls now, like, oh my God, we screwed up. What do we do? Right. So, but I do think, so I oversee the pro bono program at Milbank, and when we look at our cases now, it's a little deceiving because one litigation case produces a huge amount of work. But we actually have almost 50% or a majority of non-litigation cases in our pro bono practice now. And some of that is on the edge of litigation, like sort of restructuring, like people who go into debt and need help getting out of it. Some of it is very, very different. So there are actually a lot more opportunities in the non-litigation part. But your point is correct. Like you don't see many litigators, transactional lawyers doing litigation. What you do see though is sometimes transactional lawyers get an expertise. So I have a transactional partner in our transportation and space program who just happens to be an expert at dealing with very difficult divorce issues for women who are in untenable relationships that have to get out. He was trained by a justice. He's done numerous cases. They were administrative or a particular type of court, or people who do immigration cases in a particular format. They get trained, they become an expert, and then they can do them, no matter what they do in a day job, they can do them. So there are loads of opportunities.
Got one final question.
Oh, I'm from biology department. Early 1900, there was a case in US Supreme Court whether tomato is a vegetable or a fruit. And you mentioned that in UK, you encountered with a taxation problem. Can you explain that to me?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I answered the question.
You said that you were in UK and you were dealing with some taxation.
Oh, that was actually the US.
Oh, upstate New York.
It was upstate New York, yes, it was in the US. Yeah.
Okay, well, great. That's all we have time for. And I just want to personally add that David has really been an inspiration in my own career. For many years, I did something completely distinct from animal law as my main kind of source of income, but felt I was still able to kind of make a contribution. And then this opportunity came up, to sort of change the landscape. But and also his writing, I really tried to model my writing. There's talk a little bit about the McLeod article.
Oh, well, I mean, I think people know the McLeod case. The idea was basically that, a bunch of activists, Greenpeace activists in London, sued McDonald's for everything. Basically said that they destroyed the planet, they lie to children, they treat their animals badly, and there was a list of like 20 things. And McDonald's made the ridiculous mistake of suing them. And then McDonald's was known as having a terrible reputation that they beat you to death, which is actually far less intimidating to a bunch of activists who are completely driven on activism and who have no resources to lose. And also the libel law in England is even worse for these activists, because in America, if I can remember this right, you have the defense as a defendant that you may have a protection under the Constitution because of certain standards. In England, if you're sued for libel, the defendant has to show why every statement they made was true and not false. So this couple went and they got some really great lawyers to do pro bono work. And I don't know if anyone has seen that movie with Deborah Lipstadt, the Holocaust movie, when she brought a litigation against the Holocaust denier in the UK court. Anyway, the barrister that did that case also represented these guys. And they fought it out for like 3 years on a pro per se basis. And the court found that they had made mistakes and a number of errors, but claimed that 4 or 5 things they had said was absolutely true. And even in the course of the opinion, which is why I love the opinion so much, said, listen, actually I was a different opinion, that was Israel. But, and so it was the first time we actually got to have the issue of whether animals were treated cruelly in farming discussed by a court. And the court said, animals are treated terribly. McDonald's is responsible for that treatment. And it's absolutely true to say that they basically torture animals to raise them for food. And so I wrote that article in Animal Law.
I think it was like the longest trial in UK history.
Yeah,
Also,
that's
it
right.
was like an 800-page opinion that David did this amazing distillation of, and I mean, it was this like masterpiece. And like, man, if I could ever write anything like half that good, I consider that a great career.
The case was described as the biggest own goal in history, which is something.
Yeah. Well, please join me in thanking David.